Hey, biophysicist. Welcome back to another show. I'm happy to have with us today Lyna Luo. She's a researcher out of sunny California. Lena, thanks for being on the show.
Hi, Clark. Nice to meet you. Thank you for the interest in our study.
Yeah, it's definitely neat stuff. So, let's kind of dive right on in then. So your group is looking specifically at this kind of neat membrane protein called connexin26. So do you want to tell us a little bit about, what got you interested in it, why you're interested in it, why is it even important for us to be looking at?
Wow, that's a great question to start with. So I'm a computational biophysicist, so I like to study ion channel. And I have to tell you that compared with potassium ion channel, if you think about how much brain power and funding, went into studying potassium ion channel, those connexin ion channel are really neglected child in the family. They have
Yeah, the redheaded stepchild of membrane channels.
right. If you're not studying, those famous child. But for me, yeah, it's actually an interesting story. So we didn't actually really have any funding on this project. It was really just driven by scientific curiosity. The reason I started working on connexin was really because I met my collaborator, Andrew Harris at Rutgers University. I consider him guru of connexin channel, and also my collaborator, Jorge Contreras at UC Davis. So they are electrophysiologists, physiologists studying connexin channel, especially the hemichannel for many years. And they are the one convinced me that computational method could really play a driving role in this channel, this family of channels. So the reason is because that's how they convinced me, is that on our cell membrane, there are 21 different family of this connexin channel. And so they are all wide pore channels. So their role is not just letting potassium chloride ion go through. Their role is to let small signaling molecule to go inside, outside the cell, or go between cells, right? So the signaling molecules, including cyclic AMP, ATP, IP3, and even metabolites and sugar. So those channels are there to regulate the permeation or the trafficking of those small molecules. So you can imagine it is really important. However, for decades, people who study those channels, they don't know how, so they are all wide pore channel, but why can they be so selective for those small molecules? Because small molecule has different size, different charge, and they couldn't find any correlation between the pore radius versus the permeant size or charge. There's no correlation. So the question that mainly driving me and my group is, how do wide pore channels select permeates, right? You can imagine, is it due to the narrowest region, or maybe there's a binding site inside channel that can select binding to certain molecule, or maybe there's some kind of kinetic barrier, and those information are completely missing. And I think MD simulation can play a big role here to give those details, really start to understand where those selectivity came from.
Yeah, I mean, with anything that, especially like connexin, like you said, there's 21 different kinds and you have all different types of permeances. If you have such a high variability in this, both of the channel and also what kind of can pass through it, when you typically think of an ion channel, you think of, very, very specific mechanism, like potassium channel is only letting potassium through it. But like you said, connexin is letting, it seems like almost everything go in, and we don't know what the gatekeeper is keeping everything out. So, what kind of role can we say about MD with this? Because it is such a difficult problem to solve.
Right. So the MD simulation, yeah. So you have to study. I think to answer those questions, right, you really have to go into the atomistic detail. That's why we
Mm-hmm.
resort to MD simulation. And MD simulation is not just a tool to generate a movie of the molecule permeate from one side to the other side of pore,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, no one's lining up with popcorn to watch an MD movie, right? So
Exactly. Well, we still, as researchers, we still love to watch our own movies, though.
exactly, it's like a home movie, right?
But the key is really from those MD trajectory, you could really map out the free energy, underlying free energy, and also the kinetic detail when the molecule is permeating through the pore. So, yeah, we really have to.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said on kinetics is super interesting there, right? Because if we have some channel, we don't just have, a system in equilibrium. We have things that are coming in and out. We have all these different signaling processes. And anytime we have something that's not in equilibrium, it's really, really challenging to study, in fact. So, what exactly did your group do to try and study this kinetics?
Yeah, so Connect is really the new challenge that many groups try to figure out. Actually, I just want to mention, so back in 2017, I helped organize a workshop. It's called the Beyond KD, because we realized, it's really not just the thermodynamic property. Like for drug molecule, right? They show it's really the key off with how long does it take for the drug to leave the binding site that's correlated with drug activity. And the same for ion channel. It's maybe it's not because how strong it binds, but if you consider ion channel as a tube of the binding site with a tube shape, right? Perhaps the difference from the permeability is not about how strong you bind, but it's about the kinetics, like how fast do you enter the channel and how fast do you leave in the binding site. So kinetics is really the thing we try to capture.
I always like to say, you can tell a dying man that water's going to be kind of flowing downhill, but if the gradient's super, super small, it might be flowing downhill at such a tiny trickle. He's down there at the bottom, just never going to get any of it. So it is kind of a two-pronged problem for sure.
That's really good analog.
So I guess, you are trying to get at these kinetics here, what exactly simulation approach did you use to get after it?
Yeah, so for computing kinetics, there are many different approaches, right? We choose, actually in 2016, we published a connexin paper. We just use umbrella sampling so that we can compute the potential mean force that give you the free energy of the sugar molecule permeating through the connexin. It's the same channel, connexin26. So from the PMF is basically a free energy along the reaction coordinate, along the coordinate of channel pore. Using those free energy profile, you can also extract kinetics based on diffusion model or flux rate model. You can extract kinetic rate using those model assumption, right?
So I guess we can even take a step back then. So, what coordinate are we particularly interested about in this case?
Yeah, maybe I went too fast. So because we're interested in the permeation of molecules through the channel, and channel is mostly a tube shape, although it's not symmetric. So the best coordinate is always the distance at a different position of the tube. So we usually call it, so it's an axis normal to the membrane bilayer. And most of the time in simulation, we call it the z-axis because we just put the normal direction along the z-axis. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how that convention got started, but it's funny.
Yeah, thank you for asking me. Yeah, I forgot to clarify.
No problem. So you guys are particularly looking at cyclic AMP that's kind of shooting through this channel then. And it looks like in the paper you guys did kind of two series of simulations, right? So one is to kind of get a sense that what happens when you have kind of a lot of molecules or this cyclic AMP buzzing around. And another one is kind of at a more in-depth detail about what happens when I can look at more a single molecule going across and I can get kind of better statistics out of that. So what does using kind of this two-prong kind of like long simulation run with a lot of molecules tell you versus kind of shorter simulation runs with just a single molecule?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's exactly what we did. We used a two very different approach. Because we know to study permeation, we could, cAMP has a negative charge 1, so we could use voltage to drive it to accelerate the permeation. And if you run long enough, you can get about 20 permeation events. And from that, you can estimate the permeability or the transition time within a large uncertainty range. But those kind of approach is a no equilibrium approach, right? But if your system reaches steady state, you can at least compute the density plot, right? Accumulated density basically tells you, what's the probability of, I find a molecule at position A versus position B. So the accumulated density plot will tell you where's the binding site, where's the barrier, right? Because the binding site, you will have a higher density versus the energy barrier. But that's not a real PMF because it's a non-equilibrium process. So that's why we want to use a more rigorous, process to capture the kinetics. So I was talking about previously that we use a PMF, we can compute the relative rate. But this time we tested milestoning because the great thing about milestoning method is that it can give you the overall rate, of course, but for atomic simulation, we don't want to just know the overall rate, right? We really want to know the kinetics at each position of the channel along the channel axis, right? And that's what milestoning can give us, is the direct kinetics at each position of the channel. Those computations are still quite expensive. The CPU, GPU hour is producing lots of carbon footprint. So we'd better, get atomistic detail out of the simulation. And that's when I decided to try milestoning to get those detailed kinetics along the channel.
Yeah, so you can try, and instead of running one long brute force calculation to get, an average rate through, you can try and get, kind of this mean first passage time as kind of a function of the channel position. And that also helps highlight, I guess, where these particular barriers are for the cyclic AMP, kind of where it kind of hangs its hat, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So the milestoning has different version, right? So the version we're using is called as Markovian, Voronoi tessellated Markovian milestoning with a soft wall application. The soft wall is basically a flat bottom harmonic restraint. So we use that harmonic restraint to basically sample at every 2 angstrom region of the pore. So that can guarantee the sampling, you have a sufficient sampling because the region you're sampling in each simulation is so small, right? Just 2 angstrom along the pore. And then we can combine, so we have about 53 sub-regions, and we can really using, this milestoning approach to combine the kinetics together out of this 53, milestones, using the transition probability matrix and transition rate matrix.
Yeah, so it sounds like you just slice this thing up along the way and you run a bunch of little short simulations, kind of keeping everything in its prison cell, so to speak. And from that, you can kind of extract all the different properties you want.
You can imagine slicing sausage, kind of like that.
So I guess I kind of had one question about this voltage that you applied for, to try and kind of push things through. So, do you know roughly what a physiological voltage that could get applied is? And also, kind of how high can we tune this voltage before things kind of start to break down?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are still some debate in the field in terms of how high we can apply, because the physiological voltage, it's around -18 millivolts, and then during the excitation, you can go more positive, 100, maybe 120 millivolts. So in this case, we applied 200 millivolts, but in the end, it really depends, the rate, right? The rate, the higher voltage you apply, you will get more permeation event. So you will get less uncertainty, but also you don't want you still want to keep the integrity of your protein and your membrane. And this is also relevant with the time scale. The longer you simulate a larger voltage, the higher risk of break the system. So in our case, we decided to go with 200 millivolts and 2 microseconds. And of course, we need to monitor the membrane and protein to make sure things are not breaking.
Everything stays intact, right? Yeah, you don't just blow the house down.
So this you can check, because we apply opposite two direction of voltage. So if you can check if the results are consistent, and then you can also compare your voltage result with the equilibrium, milestoning results, right? Mm-hmm. So the consistency between two different approach is really assuring us that we are capturing the correct, physics.
Sanity check, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, because I think, we are not satisfied just by comparing, one method outcome with experimental data, because, the two approaches are always so dramatically different. They couldn't always match, and sometimes you match experimental data, but maybe you just could be lucky, right? It's not a good sanity check just with experiment data. I think nowadays, since computational time is more affordable, for me, using two different approaches to get the consistent results is really a better check. But in addition, you want to be in the similar order magnitude of experimental data, but the consistency between two different non-equilibrium and equilibrium approach are very important.
Yeah, I mean, it at least gives you some indication whether you're messing up or one of the parameters that you have is wrong. Because, usually the error bars in both computation and experiment are pretty big. So you have a lot of wiggle room to kind of go around in there with it. But I guess kind of one question is you're applying the voltage, kind of one direction, and then you turn around and apply the voltage a different direction. What changes did you see when you applied the voltages in the different directions? Was there anything in particular that stood out to you?
Yeah, so it was very interesting. So we found that if we plot the accumulated density of cAMP inside the channel, so both voltage gave the same two binding sites. There's one major binding site in the intracellular entrance, another one near the extracellular entrance, and then there's a broad energy barrier in the middle. So they give quite consistent density profile. But there are some details different, especially in the middle of the broad energy barrier. There's one dip, one small wheel in the negative voltage profile, but we did not see that from a positive voltage profile. And for quite a long time, I thought it was just because we didn't have enough events, and it was just out of—
It's an artifact, yeah.
Artifact of sampling, until we got the milestoning PMF. So milestoning PMF is without a voltage, right, with zero voltage. Mm-hmm. But there's a way to use this milestoning PMF and add on the voltage effect. So we derived the PMF under voltage using milestoning PMF, and we add the electric field, and we add the difference in the electrostatic potential between 0 voltage and 200 millivolts, and that gave us a shape of PMF under negative and positive millivolts. And we found that there's indeed a small energy wheel bisected this broad peak only under negative voltage, not positive voltage. So that was that's the moment that I realized that the voltage sampling actually was correct. It was really because the voltage has modified the equilibrium PMF. It was, that was actually my favorite part.
Yeah, that's always nice, wake up happy that day. So do you have any molecular understanding of where that kind of little other dip comes in with the negative voltage?
Yeah, so the reason is because this channel is asymmetric. So this channel has its own polarity, and also the size of the channel, it's small. It looks like a truncated cone shape. So if you look at the equilibrium PMF from milestoning, it's not symmetric. And so when you
say truncated cone shape, it's kind of like you have an ice cream cone and someone snipped the bottom out? So if they were to put it in, it would just drip out in a couple seconds.
Exactly.
So
Yeah. I hope you didn't have that trying experience.
no, it's too hot here. It usually just melts before you can even eat it. So
Exactly. So that's the shape give you, and also the charge distribution of the protein give you asymmetric PMF. And because of, so when you have an asymmetric PMF, then you add a voltage, which is symmetric, right? Positive and negative voltage, they are linear across the simulation box. At a symmetric asymmetric electric field, you will get different effects on this asymmetric PMF. So that's why the shape has changed. So it's really, yeah, it's very interesting. It's because of the intrinsic protein dipole, you know, that gave this different effect by the opposite voltage.
so I guess this might be, you know, a little more speculative, but do you think this could kind of help act as a gating mechanism then to keep certain molecules in or out of the cell?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know about the gating yet because the connexin gating is quite complicated. So it can be gated by pH, calcium, also voltage. Yeah, so they have, it's a polymodal gating mechanism, but what we observe by different voltage could play a role. That's what I can see.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things happening inside a cell, right? Which is why it makes it so fun and so hard to kind of study then.
Right. But this is, yeah, this is really the first time we see how, you know, voltage can asymmetrically modify the underlying PMF.
Was there anything else kind of in this study that, you know, really stood out to you when you did it, that kind of caught you by surprise?
Yes, actually. So we were able to compute the permeability of the channel. So the permeability of a channel is actually intrinsic property of the channel. So it's independent of voltage or concentration. So you have this intrinsic property you can compute, and there are actually two experimental value for the permeability of connexin channel for cyclic AMP. So I spent some time trying to get that value actually from my two simulation. So I was able to compute the permeability from the voltage using this famous GHK current equation. And I was also able to find a paper that illustrates the relation between the permeability and mean first pass time. So using these two equations, I could derive the channel permeability that's directly comparable with experimental value. And they turns out was the experimental value is from two independent groups, so they have a quite large range. So ours pretty much sit in the middle of them. So I was quite happy about that.
Yeah, that's nice, right?
Yeah, but also just be able to figure out how to derive, you know, how to link our mean first pass time and the voltage, you know, permeability to the experimental measured permeability. I was very happy just be able to link that. So in the future, you know, we can study many different permeability using those equations.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely hard to get a PMF from experimental data for sure.
Right.
So I guess I have one kind of question then. You know, you looked at cyclic AMP kind of coming through this channel then, but you only had cyclic AMP. Do you have any kind of thoughts about what would happen if maybe there was a competition for this thing? You know, it's fighting against other things to kind of come out. Would that affect the rate through it at all? Or would the protein open or close different? How would that influence it?
Oh yeah, great question. So we don't just have cyclic AMP in the system, so we also have a potassium and chloride, and we actually see the you know, so because the channel is wide enough, while the cyclic AMP is permeating, we also see the permeation of potassium chloride, and we will actually be able to compute the ratio of the permeability between cyclic AMP and the potassium, and that one you can also match the experimental value. They have the relative permeability. It was also quite close. So that was comforting. But yeah, again, we also had magnesium, and I guess you can also put other competing permeants, right? So And also we don't have the protein open closure, in the simulation. So this simulation is only done with the open state of the channel.
Mhm.
Right? So I guess I would call this study a proof of concept. Basically, we wanted to see whether milestoning will be a useful, affordable method to study small molecular permeation through the wide pore, right? And whether it will be consistent with the voltage. And we also show that voltage simulation is also quite useful to study the selectivities. So I guess it's a proof of concept, but in the future, we really want to use those methods to study, as you said, maybe a different protein conformation.
Yeah, building blocks up, right? There's always another degree of complexity you can add.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I guess kind of my last question then is if you were to kind of go back to the very beginning of the study, is there anything you would have tried to do differently?
Great. Wow, this is such a good question, because don't we always wish to go back to time and restart our project
Yeah,
with
exactly.
a better experimental design, right? It's like, oh, now
Mhm.
I should have done that. So this is really great. I think we should always add that section at the end of paper. So yeah, there are several things I think I could improve. For the voltage simulation, I think we, in order to have enough permeation events, so we added quite a lot of cAMP, and we actually observed some cAMP. They cluster around the entrance of the intracellular side, because there were a cluster of positive amino acids. And I in the paper I discussed, I think it's mostly artifact of higher concentration of cAMP.
So the cyclic AMP is kind of queuing up like, shoppers at the grocery store waiting to go through the register?
Actually, not really, because the binding, actually that's a major binding site, right? But it's a hexamer. The protein is really wide, so they were able to accommodate several cAMP binding. But because it's a wider side of the channel, even when you have the cAMP bind, you can still have other cAMP permeate through without waiting in the queue, actually. So that's very different from
So we got a line skipper here.
exactly. So that's very different than the potassium channel that they have to line up, right?
Yeah.
But I think so. It's possible that in our cell, at certain pathologic condition, maybe you have local high cAMP concentration, but otherwise, physiologically, the concentration are very low. So it's less likely they would occur, like binds multiple at the same time. So I think lower concentration would eliminate this multiple binding effect.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of hints at maybe some idea of cooperativity, but if you have a low enough concentration, it's really, really hard to be cooperative.
Right, because yeah, you need really, it's really about the local concentration. Another thing I think we can do is, we're using milestoning, which has a, we focus sampling at a smaller region of the sesame, you can see. So that has an enhanced sampling, advantage, right? You only sample small region, but we still have some region, especially near binding site. Sampling was quite hard. In one of the window, I think we had to sample almost a microsecond time scale to get the mean first pass time converged. So I think to make things more efficient, next step would to develop, add more enhanced sampling method within the milestoning window, right? We already heard people has done like weighted ensemble milestoning, and we can also apply other like Hamiltonians, maybe annealing just on the milestoning window. This is something we need to explore. So right now we build actually a carbon nanotube already used as toy model to test, if we can further make this milestoning sampling more efficient. The last thing I would like to improve is, I really think this method, this milestoning is really useful for this kind of study, and there are so many channels out there. So right now our code is published on GitHub, so it's a Jupyter notebook, but if I have time, I would like to make it even more user-friendly.
Oh yeah, I mean, the documentation's never perfect, right? There's always room for improvement.
Yeah, because the code, is so long, right? So I would like to make it more user friendly, yeah, for everybody.
So you mentioned your GitHub. Is there another way people can follow along with your work if they want to catch up on what you're doing or try and, see new insights that come from your group?
Yeah, sure. So I often update our research results on Twitter, a few tweets, and my Twitter handle is Lyna _Luo, so YUNLUO.
Yeah, we'll link it in the tweet for the show as well, and I'll put it in the comments. So if you want to follow her group, absolutely do it.
Oh,
Lyna,
yeah, I already did.
Well, Lyna, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much.